Hello there and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, the podcast that takes you inside the football boardroom with me, Adrian Goldberg and Charlie Methven. And this time, a Celtic special with our guest, David Lowe. David is a Scottish businessman who recently created Celtic Supporters Limited to represent the club's 28,000 minority shareholders. The boys have just reappointed the human boomerang, Martin O'Neill, after sacking Wilfred Nancy, who lasted just 33 days. Beat that, Brian Clough. By my reckoning, it's O'Neill's third spell in charge at Parkhead as a sense of crisis engulfs the green and white side of Glasgow. As we record this, Celtic are second in the SPL behind Hearts, which doesn't sound terrible, but supporters have been pointing to the huge cash reserves on which the club is sitting and the apparent lack of ambition to push on in Europe, being seemingly content to win the league every year, qualify for the Champions League, and sit back and count the cash. Maybe that's unfair. Who knows? We'll chat about that in a few moments. So welcome, David. Welcome, Charlie. Charlie, what's your FA Cup third round weekend been like before we chat to David?
I've actually taken a leaf out of your book, Adrian, in that I attended an FA Trophy game yesterday instead of an FA Cup game. I went to see a friend of mine, an American friend of mine who owns a London non-league club called Walton and Hersham, the Swans, and they were taking on Brackley Town, come from near where I come from in Oxfordshire. They're in the National League right now, and the Swans, who are in the 7th tier, albeit top of the 7th tier, turned over Brackley to get through to the last 16 of the FA Trophy with a late winner. So it was great fun in front of almost 2,000 people at a 7th tier game, showing how strong the pyramid is as a whole. What about you, Adrian? You heading off to watch West Brom lose to Swansea today?
Yeah, well, I can't get out of my road at the moment. I'm genuinely snowed in. I live on a sloping road, which is very difficult to get out of in the midst of snowfall. And we've had a big downpour by our standards in the West Midlands. So the Baggies are playing as we record this. I'm anticipating a game away at Swansea in the third round of the FA Cup. So I'll watch that on a stream and look forward to next Friday night when we play at home again against Middlesbrough, hopefully with a new manager in tow, having sacked Ryan Mason, which I told you, I think, Charlie, was inevitable. Sad, but inevitable. Anyway, enough of matters south of the border. Let us welcome David Lowe. And David, I mentioned you set up this group called the Celtic Supporters Limited. Tell me why have you found it necessary to do that? I mean, just to say a bit of context, and we'll talk a bit about this as we go through. But I mean, you've got a long history of supporter activism at Celtic, and you were involved in the removal of what was known as the biscuit tin board in the in the late 80s, early 90s. We'll talk about that a bit. But just tell me about what's happening now and why so many Celtic supporters are so cheesed off with the current board.
Well, we think the current board under the tutelage of Dermot Desmond has become remote, detached, unambitious. There's lots of epithets you could apply to them. We think they're underinvesting in the stadium, which is now old. It was pretty state of the art, when I was involved back in the day. Brand new, 60,000, one of the biggest in Britain, I think second only to Manchester United at the time. But there's been little investment in the fabric and not enough investment in the team. And the consequence of that is that for somebody of my age, we're increasingly experiencing ritual humiliation in Europe. When I was a kid, we were regularly in the quarterfinals, semi-finals, and a couple of European Cup finals. That's the Celtic I grew up with. And we're sort of increasingly surrendering that status through lack of investment. Accumulated £77 million in the bank, second only to Tottenham Hotspur, I think, in the UK, who have a much larger turnover. And it's earning like 1 or 2% interest when it should really be reinvested in the club, whether it's in the fabric, the stadium, etc., or whether it's in the team. I could go on, but on the park, we regularly don't buy players in the windows. We sold our two of our best players, don't have a recognised, experienced centre forward. And in this year's Champions League qualifier, we get knocked out by what can honestly be called a Diddy team. And that's 40, 50 million euros down the pan, simply, because the board are not up to scratch. So I could go on and on, but I won't. And that's the summary of where all this disrest, unrest in the Celtic family exists. That's the genesis of it all. And
the club's owner, or the person often referred to as the owner, or the person seen as the figurehead of the club, is Dermot Desmond, who is the largest shareholder of Celtic. But Celtic is a club that has a very wide and disparate shareholding. I mentioned that you represent, or seeking to represent, 28,000 minority shareholders. So the Dermot Desmond doesn't control the club. His consortium or his group doesn't have 51%. Is that correct?
Well, that's technically correct. They do effectively control the club, or to be even more precise, his private equity company, because he doesn't own shares personally. His private equity company, International Investment and Underwriting, owns 35% of the ordinary voting shares. So that's 35% of 100%, obviously. But what you find in sporting organisations and football clubs in particular is that there is a huge untraced element, because most people that are shareholders in football clubs are not buying them as an investment. They're not what you would call sophisticated investors, familiar with the ways of the city, etc. They bought these shares usually because there's a crisis involved. And that's where most of Celtic shareholders came from when we floated the club in 1995 on AIM. Or it wasn't AIM then, but it's AIM now. So that's a generation ago. And what you have is increasing number of people that bought the shares dying. And if you're not a sophisticated investor, what that means is that the shares go into limbo, because, you don't know about executories in the States, and you got to tell the club. Also, people in Scotland, you call it flitting, moving, relocating. So you're doing this, that, and the other when you move house, but you're really not thinking, well, I have to tell the club's registrar, what's a registrar? So this has a cumulative effect. And it's the way that the old Celtic board back in the day managed to control the club from a minority position. They never had control, but they had effective control. So in most quoted companies, the average is 4 or 5%, but in sporting clubs, it's 10, 20%. Now in Celtic, I've used an algorithm to calculate, it's about 20%. That's 5,000 shareholders are untraced. That's 5,000 people that can't vote on key matters. That's 5,000 people that don't receive their dividends, which can be appropriated by the club after 12 years. So it's having a cumulative effect. Long answer to a short question, but to summarise it, what it means is Dermot Desmond's 35% of 100% is really 35% of 80%, which is effective control. So he has control, and he gained that control in 2005. Celtic had 5 share issues in 10 years, and each successive one had less and less uptake by fans, because fans put everything they had in the first one. So subsequent ones get less and less uptake. That allowed the fat cats, the businessmen like myself and others, to gain a disproportionate shareholding base in the club. Now, this was against what I was in favour of when I was working with Fergus McCann. We wanted a balance between the ordinary fan and the corporate interests, because football was sexy in the 90s. We're all coming to the stock market, and media companies were taking stakes. So we had that balance, but after Fergus left, that balance disappeared through these successive share issues. And Dermot Desmond's company has had effective control since 2005. And that's 20 years. Now, you can look at a football club's success domestically in Europe. So outsiders or even the board will say, what have you guys got to complain about? Domestically, you've had the most successful period in your history. But to use the Glasgow phrase, there's been nae Rangers about, because they've been missing in action for most of this century.
They went bust, of course, famously, didn't they?
Well, you said it, not me. I'm trying not to be. But if you think about it, the Celtics, only two clubs, if we ignore the liquidation, have won it in the last 40 years, the championship. But Celtics had no domestic opposition because Rangers' big banking relationship disappeared in the crash of 2008. They were liquidated in 2012, and different factions have been fighting with each other since then. So they've been missing in action and left the field open to us. And, we have had this domestic success that people say, what do you got complaining about? Well, as I said at the top of this podcast, I'm one of those guys that saw Celtic beat Leeds home and away. Even saw them beat Blackburn and Liverpool, back in the day before the Dermot Desmond years. And I judge success for Celtic and it is one of the biggest clubs in Britain, right up there with Man United, Liverpool, and Arsenal. And all that's missing is the television money because we're in a smaller league. So I'm ambitious for Celtic on the park. Lots of people my age are similar, and we think it's colossal mismanagement to be humiliated by Diddy teams, if I can call it that, in Europe. So this is, but since post-COVID, there's been a catalogue of huge mistakes, and it's all sort of come to a head.
I'll bring Charlie in a moment, but just again, so people can understand that context. And somebody who's watched football at Celtic over a number of years and was a particularly frequent visitor around that time of the old biscuit tin board at the turn of the 90s. But in the Champions League this year, you lost to Kairat Almaty of Kazakhstan. And Charlie and I have discussed before how Belgian clubs using, in the case of Union Saint-Gilloise, data analytics and so on, but also other clubs like Bruges have now eclipsed Celtic in Europe. Clubs who may be regarded as being coming from a similar league as Scotland, but who are nowhere near of the stature of Celtic. Yeah. So the summer also saw ructions about lack of transfer activity, the departure of Brendan Rodgers. Can you get to the bottom of why Celtic are sitting on this cash mountain when, over and above winning the SPL, the club doesn't appear to be progressing on the pitch?
Well, it's actually regressing. Dermot Desmond's son at the AGM, which was another huge, colossal, I'm trying not to swear, mess up, says it's rainy day money. That's the phrase he used. It's rainy day money. And the lack of success or relative success was put down to the financial gap between our former European contemporaries and the Scottish League. Well, that's not stopped sort of very small clubs like Midtjylland or Noorderland or that Bodo Glimt, or never mind the Belgian teams, the Dutch teams, the Portuguese teams, who 20 years ago were sort of similarly sized secondary leagues, behind the big 4 or 5. So, we have slipped way behind. And it's because, we do have an older reactionary board. The NEDs have been there way beyond their sell-by date, or if you want to be official, the QCA, Coded Company Alliance recommendations for AIM companies. When there's a situation's vacant, they look to somebody, whether it's on the park or in the boardroom, somebody that's been there before. They fish in a small pond.
The NEDs being the non-executive directors, yeah? Yeah,
non-executive directors. They've all been there more than 9 years, and then you bring back the former chief executive as the chairman. And listen, it's very common in football. I remember trying to get Celtic to get a website in the 90s, and they thought I was crazy. And it's the same. It's similar, with this generation with data analytics. Now, I've actually worked with Sabermetrics, which is what it was originally called with baseball back in the early noughties with Billy Bean and Oakland Athletics.
This is the original Moneyball setup.
Yeah, this is the original data analytics, data science. I'm into data analytics. It's great, but it's one tool in a toolbox. It's not the panacea to success. But Celtic haven't even done it. Billy Bean was with Sabermetrics, Data Analytics, Oakland Athletics. He was considered crazy for a few years, and everybody poo-pooed him. And what he brought to the Athletics was relative outperformance. They didn't really actually win anything. They just made an average team above average. Then eventually everybody else caught on, and everybody else was doing similar, and that sporting advantage sort of dissipated. And something similar is going on just now with data analytics. It's one tool in a toolbox. At the end of the day, you still need a good coach or a good manager. But Celtic are nowhere at the races, nowhere of any consequence. It's doing it on the cheap, doing it all on the side, and typically doing it with somebody you know, or a friend knows somebody that's into this data analytics thing. So is one of the reasons Celtic are sort of falling behind as data analytics has grown in the game. And Heart of Midlothian, as you know, are using it with Tony Bloom and Jamestown, and they're doing it properly and they're doing it big. And he paid an entry fee, a 10% stake into Hearts to use that tool with Hearts. And that's why Hearts are outperforming. Whether they win the league or not is another matter. They're top just now, and I think they're playing today. But, Celtic really appear to be nowhere in this debate. Modern day football looks like this. You have to use data science. You have to invest in the squad, invest in the stadium. We're basically run on a care and maintenance basis. That's what it looks like. It looks like a private equity investment. We're controlled by two investment firms. One, I mentioned, Dermot Desmond's private equity firm, and we're one investment in a big portfolio of investments. And we're run private equity style by an investment management team that's looking after his investment. And you could say that if the board is looking after Dermot's investment, it must be looking after all our investments as well. The only difference is we're not in it principally as an investment. We're in it for a football success. And that's where the difference is. The other big shareholder, by the way, is Nick Train at Lindsay Train. Very big investment company in the city. He's got a Celtic investment in two funds. It's the smallest investment in the two funds. And even if the Celtic stock price doubled or trebled, it would have no effect on the performance of the fund that holds it. So it's a mystery as to why this investment company owns these shares. But that's who controls Celtic just now. And the view of an increasing number of Celtic fans is our board is not fit for purpose and is not doing a good job. In fact, there's more. You got me on to talk about this, so I'll talk about it.
Well, I think it's only fair to let Charlie have a say. It's very rare.
Charlie, on you go, Charlie. You can interrupt. The floor's Charlie's.
Well, I mean, that was actually quite a pithy summary of the situation, because there's so much to this, and there's a few elements I want to add to what David said. The first one of which is, you'll be aware, Adrian, that I grow impatient of fan bases criticising ownerships for not spending enough money, right? And the reason for that is that there is no money to spend, in that the club itself does not generate enough money. The owner has to fill the gaps, and the fans then tell the owner, we don't want to pay anything more, but you should pay more. And I believe this to be unreasonable behaviour, illogical, unreasonable, and actually just decadent. The Celtic situation is precisely the other way round. Dermot Desmond is not the owner. Dermot Desmond is simply the major minority shareholder who has ended up manoeuvring himself into a position of control. But Dermot does not put any money into the club. All of the money at Celtic is generated by the fans of Celtic, right? And indeed, not only that, but the fans of Celtic own a majority of the shares in the club as well. So effectively, the Celtic fan base, of all the fan bases outside Germany in the world, and one or two Spanish clubs and one or two Argentine clubs, out of all the fan bases in the world who have an absolute right to say, we don't like the way our money is, or in this case, is not being spent, Celtic's fan base are the ones who have the right to do that, because they're the ones who have actually done what I've always advocated, which they've got off their arse. They've supported their club with their own cash. They've bought shares. They've invested in the club, and now indeed still provide all the revenue that drives all of this huge cash surplus. Now, David has mentioned, and I think Celtic fans are actually, in my mind, quite also as a whole, quite educated in their perception of the situation. It's not just, oh, can you wang some more money on players? It's much broader than that. It's much broader than that, which is to say, David uses the phrase that the Celtic board is not at the races. This is correct. He also mentions that data and the usage of data is one element, but it's only one element, right?
Yeah.
So if you think about the 80 million quid that the Celtic board is sat upon, my God, as an executive, I would love to be in their shoes. I would absolutely love to be in their shoes. There are sweeter things that big modern clubs have as options to do to achieve at least par performance, if not outperformance, right? Now, let's just explore a few of those, because data, the usage of data is one of those. And by the way, by no means the most expensive of them. It's much more a question of really sort of management, utility and expertise and, having the right people in the building. They're not always the most expensive people either. But there are some fundamental challenges that Celtic has, which can be overcome and are overcome by other clubs in their situation. So one big challenge they have is that a massive preponderance of Super Elite players in the modern game are of African Caribbean origin. And to put it bluntly, there aren't many people of African Caribbean origin in Scotland. And a lot of Celtic fans ask me, why does our academy so underperform? And I tell them, I'm afraid to say, it's because you don't have enough African Caribbean players in your academy. And that's just the way it goes. And you can see that throughout Europe, right? So effectively, other clubs in this situation have disintermediated that problem by buying feeder clubs and academies in different parts of the world, which have enabled them to create a pipeline of young talent so that you're not always out there in the market buying mature talent, which is difficult. It's difficult for two reasons. First of all, it's very expensive. Secondly, there's a challenge of persuading Super Elite talent to come to the Scottish League. But that's not such a challenge if you already have them on the books at the age of 19 or 20, and they're playing for your feeder team in Belgium or in Portugal or whatever it might be, and they've come from your academy on the Ivory Coast. Now, these are all things that have been done. This is not pie in the sky. David mentioned earlier on Midtjylland from Denmark. Well, they are the European club of the Right to Dream project that takes players from Ghana to Denmark. Now, if that can be conceived as an idea to take elite young players from Ghana to Denmark, why cannot elite young players come from Ghana to Celtic? Ultimately, of course, they can. It's absolutely doable. Yeah. It's perfectly achievable. And the constraint on most of us when it comes to all of these things that you might do, when I say all of us football chief executives, is we don't have the capital. We do not. This is the biggest problem we face. And Celtic is one of the only clubs that is in the unbelievably fortunate position of having this perfect situation, right, where they have huge amounts of revenue, but don't actually need to spend it all just on winning their own league. So they can afford to be more strategic. They can afford to be a bit cleverer, box a bit cleverer, and do some more strategic things, which enable them in the end to go and compete with their direct peers, which in my mind, what's Celtic's peer? Benfica, Sporting Lisbon, Anderlecht, Ajax Amsterdam. This is the peer group, right? But all these other clubs are doing smart things. If you look at Lisbon's connections, with the broader footballing world and the pipelines of talent that come into Lisbon, it's been worked up over a very long period of time. So that's one big point I would make. And I think the Celtic fans are absolutely right. And to have this fundamental underlying concern, which is it's not just about can we buy a striker. It's actually that our board are all very old, out of step, don't understand the way in which the game has gone, and are not at the races when it comes to understanding what it can be for us to progress. Now, there's one last point I want to make, which is I see the next 15 years as a time of huge opportunity for Celtic. And the reason for that is that the TV rights deals across the major leagues in Europe, excepting England and maybe Spain, are collapsing. Right? So in other words, the disadvantage that Scottish clubs have had vis-a-vis, let's say, the French clubs is disappearing, right? So if you look 2 or 3 years ago, the French top division had a TV deal worth 500 million a year, and the Scottish, I think is 60 or 70 million, something like that, David. So a big difference. Now that TV deal has collapsed, and the French clubs are now receiving 150 million euros a year, which is 125 million pounds. So the TV revenue gap between the top French clubs and Celtic has been crunched. And with the exception of PSG, Lyon, and Marseille, Celtic's other revenues would dwarf the rest of the French clubs, right?
Yeah.
So effectively, you're now in a situation where Celtic should be able to compete against the French clubs. The Belgian league it's lost its TV deal. It's probably going to win the court case, but ultimately it's going to be in the same situation where it's been used to having 120 million a year. Now it's going to be more like 50 or 60 million a year. It's likely the Italian league will follow suit, etc. So effectively, you're going to end up in a situation where the Scottish league itself is less of a hindrance, right?
Yeah.
And at that point, the Scottish league becomes Celtic's advantage, because effectively, when you think about European competition, the ability to not necessarily have to play at 100% of your entire intensity every single week is what then enables you to really give your best midweek in Europe. And this is something which has been a big advantage for Belgian and Portuguese clubs, and why they've managed to outperform other European clubs, including English clubs at times in Europe, is that if you play in a slightly less competitive league and you can rotate your squad in a more aggressive way, it means that you're putting a fresh team onto the pitch in Europe. So I see the next 10 to 15 years as potentially hugely exciting for Celtic if they get this right? And that's why I'm so interested in what David's doing, particularly actually as I found out something which I didn't know until a week ago, which is that my wife is a shareholder at Celtic. So I need to put her in touch with you, David.
Yes, you should join the CSL. But listen, Charlie, I agree with everything you said there. I mean, the history of football is one of evolution. And I think we're at the cusp of the next phase. I think the landscape is changing. The TV contracts, which have distorted the market, that's changing for the betterment of the smaller leagues, as you suggest. Younger people are consuming product a different way from the older generation. But, in order to exploit and benefit from these changes in the landscape, you have to have a board that recognises the changes in the landscape and seeks to exploit it for the benefit of the team. And I'm very familiar with Midtjylland. Tom Vernon, who you probably know as an associate of mine, and he's away now, but, he set up that Right to Dream in Ghana, got all the African kids, and it's been able to, and the proceeds from all these developed players selling on to the larger clubs has helped finance the status that Midtjylland now enjoy. Now, all of that could have been Celtic's. There were attempts to engage with Celtic, which I was involved in, but they don't want to know if it's out the box. They don't want to know. It's run on a care and maintenance basis.
Yeah, and Charlie's spoken before on this podcast, David, about the supporter potential at Celtic as well. And as I say, I've got some feeling for and history with Celtic through my very best friend, who was sadly passed away now, who was a Celtic season ticket holder. But my club, West Brom, let's say we've got a 26,000 capacity stadium now. Really, you probably wouldn't be looking, even in the very most optimistic scenario, beyond a 32,000 capacity stadium for West Brom. But that would be optimistic. For Celtic, who have a 60,000 capacity stadium, and I'm just ripping you off here, Charlie, Celtic could quite feasibly have an 80,000 capacity stadium and fill it. And in an era of declining TV revenues, bums on seats, people in the stadium is real money that can make a difference, particularly when your spending will be pegged to your income. And that is something which at the moment Celtic are underutilising, because the stadium isn't big enough to accommodate all the people who might want to go and watch a successful Celtic team.
Yeah, the stadium. Well, they can get the capacity up more than it is, but it's too risky, and they're not doing it. But the stadium's embarrassing now. The Champions League games, when or games in Europe, the best fan seats are used to accommodate the press, and the press are in a big tent in the car park. The stadium's old and it's embarrassing, and the Wi-Fi is terrible. It really is. Way behind where it should be. But as I said, they've been able to get away with it because there's been no opposition. But I think that is changing, and we must change to move with the times. We are going to have greater competition from Rangers. For the first time this century, Rangers have stability. They do have a dominating, controlling shareholder in the form of the 49ers consortium. So that's something they've not had before. Or recently, since David Murray messed it up. The stability. They also have, for the first time in 15 years, access to money. it's the same as Leeds have access to money. The other team that 49ers Enterprises are involved with. So we're going to, and then factor in the data analytics, etc. And you have domestic competition, which if Celtic recognise, will be a good thing. And then, of course, and the embrace data analytics and all the changes in the market that Charlie was referring to there. The future is very bright for Celtic because it is a very, very big club. Here's something I've always done. I've taken the family to Florida for 35 years now, and I always apply the Disney test when I'm there. That is, I count the football jerseys, and the 4 winning teams for football jerseys in Disneyland are, guess what? You can guess them. It's Manchester United, Liverpool, Celtic, and Rangers. That they're the 4 big clubs that have fans out with their domicile. You'll see Rangers jerseys in London. You'll either see them in Birmingham, Greater Birmingham, Manchester, all over the place. And it's the same with Liverpool, Manchester United, and Celtic. That's the 4 big teams as determined by fan bases. But Celtic and Rangers have missed out because they don't have that TV money. But that economic advantage for the other English clubs is dissipating now, as Charlie suggests. And the outlook for Celtic, if the board recognises the changes that were at a cusp of change, is starting to get bright again, and we want the fans to have a say in that. That's what CSL is all about. I think we're about to end soon, are we not?
Well, I was going to say, David, you have got form in this, and this podcast isn't long enough to go into all the detail. But there was a board which you helped to unseat at Celtic previously when Fergus McCann came in and took power, known as the Biscuit Tin Board, and it did later emerge that the cash at Celtic and receipts were held in shoe boxes. This was in the late 80s. So you were part of the revolution that helped to get rid of a board on a previous occasion. So
that was a time of change as well, and a similar dynamic at play here. I won't go into it because we don't have time, other than to say that the Celtic board didn't have any money to address. We're all old enough to remember the Taylor report. If you didn't have seats in your stadium by 1994-5, you couldn't use the stadium, and that was the Celtic predicament. They didn't anticipate changes in the marketplace. They didn't anticipate money entering the game. They didn't anticipate, the multimedia deals, and we're in a similar dynamic at play just now.
So I just got a question before we finish, right? So you've set up Celtic Supporters Limited to represent small shareholders, of which there are many, and ultimately, if you're successful, you could end up both by finding shares which have been lost, but also by getting proxy votes for shares that still exist. You could end up with more than 20. You could end up representing more than 25% of the shareholder base. And I've read in the media that is your aim, which would effectively, under company rules, give you a sort of blocking, because it's a quoted company, would effectively give you a sort of blocking vote over certain elements of what the existing board can and can't do. But fundamentally, is it not your ambition to remove the current board?
Well, that's sort of a pejorative way of putting it. But yeah. You got to start somewhere, and you start with the 3 A's, which is activating, which is the untraced shares; accumulating, which is buying shares with your cash flow from your memberships; and aggregating, which is aggregating proxy votes, and that will take you so far. I think that, and I've got shares, big shareholding. I know lots of people with big shareholdings. I think we can comfortably, we're already above 1%, and 5% is achievable, and 5% is a call an AGM threshold, and that's where you got to start from. But at the end of the day, the object is to restore that balance that I was talking about at the top of this program, because we don't want to be fan owned, because there's downsides to that as well. I think Charlie alluded to that. You want balance between the corporate interests and the fan interests, and I'm one of these few people that straddle both worlds, so I understand the dynamics at play in both sides of the equation. So I want that balance back. Our ambition ultimately is to go to 29.9%. which is it's a public limited company. It's regulated by the Takeover panel and the AIM market rules. So where are we going to get 29.9%? That comes from buying out Dermot or buying out Nick Train. There you go. And we need money to do that. That's £100 million. So I'm in. Are you and Charlie? Yeah.
David, thank you. And thank you to Charlie. We will speak to you again, David. If Dermot Desmond and his pals want to chat to us as well on the podcast, we'd love to hear their point.
Good luck with that one.
Too. But thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, by the way, on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, and on Spotify to this podcast. We'll be back again next week. Thank you to Charlie. Thank you to David Lowe. We will speak again on another occasion. Thank you, fellas.
Thanks, David.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Adrian.